Hi everyone, so in this lesson we're going to turn to the national minimum wage and the national living wage. Now these policy interventions are made by the government and they simply set out to create a wage floor for the low paid to thereby actually increase the incomes of the low paid. So clearly there's an attempt being made here to make sure that workers are protected from potential monopsonies who can exploit the labour at a lower cost because they're the dominant buyer of labour, of course, in their industry, and it can help to actually improve the distribution of income across an economy in theory. There can be some problems though, and of course we'll investigate those too. Okay, so the national living wage was introduced in 2016 and was proposed by George Osborne and subsequently released in 2016, and really this is really an attempt to actually reflect the cost of living to ensure that people are actually getting a wage rate which is commensurate with the living costs that they face. Okay, now the intention is that by 2020 this will rise to £9 an hour. I think at the time of speaking it's about £7.50 or so. Now it's deliberately set above the rate of the national living wage and was first introduced for those over the age of 25. And the intention here is to help these low income earners reach 60% of median earnings by 2020, and hence that £9 per hour wage rate. Now the Labour politicians, well, they argue that this hasn't gone far enough, and actually that the national living wage isn't quite significant enough to reflect the true cost of living. Okay, so there's a lot of discussion that's actually made about this. Right, so what we can actually turn to now is just thinking about how a national minimum wage may actually disrupt or cause various circumstances in these labour markets. So let's firstly look at our perfectly competitive labour market. We've come to know this model very well here. Sorry, that should be EPC. Okay, so we've got WPC and EPC. So we've got the MRP curve, the supply of labour curve. Now, you'll be pleased to hear when it comes to these diagrams, really we're dealing with the same diagrams that we've seen previously for the trade union model. In essence, the national minimum wage, when that's been introduced since 1998, it has just been slightly above the equilibrium level, and that's done deliberately. I'm going to draw it higher than that just because it then provides clarity in terms of illustrating this diagram. Okay, so we've got WNMW. Okay, now we've got those 2 points here where, in effect, once again, we see that the supply curve for labour has now, in essence, become perfectly elastic. The marginal cost of employing this employee is the same as this one, the same as this one. So the average cost, the marginal cost of labour is exactly the same right up to this point here. Now, we've got E2 will represent that as, and E1 just there. Okay, so very, very similar to the disruptive impact that trade unions can have in perfectly competitive labour markets, or so the theory goes. Okay, so what we see is really firstly that there's this income group here. Okay, they now want to actually join the marketplace and actually start participating in that labour market. So the participation rate raises from EPC to E2. This is because their reservation wages were above the equilibrium but are below the national minimum wage. So they now want to enter the marketplace. Meanwhile, we can see those that were in employment at EPC, well, actually, there's a reduced demand now for employment at that higher wage cost. And in effect, marginal cost of labour equals the marginal revenue product of labour at this point, coinciding with E1. So therefore, there would be an increase in direct unemployment, workers made redundant here from EPC to E1. But as a total, we can see the anticipated effect here would be that unemployment would increase significantly as a result of the increased participation rates, okay, and those workers that have been made unemployed there. All right, so yeah, very, very nice example to consider. But those workers that remain in employment, of course, they're better off. They're better off, they're earning a higher wage, so they're going to be fairly happy with that. And yeah, their income has increased, okay, so their standard of living would also improve, of course. Okay, so we can see disruptive impact there. Let's now turn to monopsony labour market. Now, if we look at this monopsony labour market, I think it's just useful just to remind ourselves of how we actually plot this out. So we focus on the point where MC equals MR, and then from there we see where the supply curve is, and that, of course, reflects our wage costs, which we can highlight across like so. Okay, so we've got WM and EM standing for wage and monopsony and employment and monopsony labour market. Okay, so the impact of the national minimum wage, once again, is to, and I'm just going to do this directly in line with this point, just because it keeps the diagram nice and simple and straightforward to remember. It could theoretically be any point. It depends how high above the well, not the equilibrium, but the monopsony labour market outcome actually is here. Okay, so we can see that we would reach this point here, and we can call that WNMW. Okay, so we can see that, yeah, actually, this is exactly the same once again as the trade unions diagram that we considered. So employment is raised under this minimum wage, or this higher living wage if you prefer. Okay, but it's possible that when it comes to the living wage, well, we could actually determine a difference here. So we could actually say perhaps the national minimum wage is there, but the living wage is beyond that, okay, because it is set at a higher rate quite deliberately. Okay, so we can see that sort of outcome taking place here. So there is the potential here once again for increased employment costs, of course, for the monopsony or the small firm, as in this case, and that could potentially reduce supernormal profits. So that's a nice argument to present there. But just as we've seen with trade unions, they can help to boost up wages, and that can have a good impact on inequality. Okay, so we can see those arguments quite clearly there. Thinking back to when this was first introduced in 1998 though, this was introduced in the background of what we saw in our last lesson, where trade union membership was really on the decline, and it was a Labour government that of course first introduced it. Now the Conservatives seem all for it. I wonder if part of the reason for that though is because it will incentivise firms to actually think about actually investing in capital goods and thereby increase productivity. Okay, so that's it guys. We'll move on to further analysis and evaluation of this next time. Thank you.